bureaucrats who are interested in the detail but often aren't particularly guided or clear about the wider story that they want to tell about what kind of society we've got and what kind of politics we should aim for. And then you have the other folk on the other side who can do all the bluster, the magic legerdemain and light and nice stories which make people feel good about themselves but have no interest whatever in the substance of our politics. And I think both evils need to be avoided.
Sure, and I think stories need to be told. I mean, it's quite interesting. The four or three pieces that ran in the Scotland on Sunday supporting the yes case, and I think there's 4 now supporting the no case. Kareem Polwarth's piece, I thought, was the best out of all of them, simply because she was bold enough to say, "I felt ambivalent about this in the past. I still want to kind of hold to my pure ideals, but I see, yes, as the way forward." But the way that she told it, the way she brought in personal details, the way she brought in straightforward and naive aspiration, the way that she then also, focused down onto particular issues, it felt like a real human voice. And I think storytelling, Jerry Hassan's has been on about this for ages, but I think we've got to find a medium for it now, and whether the social media is a medium for it, whether live events are a medium for it, I'm not sure. But I think the thing about storytelling for citizens is that it's a way for them to possess the totality of their experience. You can say how you feel, you can say what you want, you can say what you're annoyed about, you can talk about a specific, but if you actually say, tell me your story about why you think independence, and tell me your whole story about why you think independence is a good idea. And I think that gets us away from the constant barrage of fact battles and factoid battles, which I think what they do to people is actually almost, to a sense, turn them off the idea of the public realm itself. We have to try and reoccupy the imagination of what you're talking about, independence, in a kind of creative, cultural way. There are moves afoot. One
thing on that point, which I think I wrote something a while back about Devo Max as being a nationalist life raft, but who was it for? Was the title I gave it. Mm-hmm. And it was during a twinge of sort of, I suppose, for me, personal sadness that I've came to the conclusion that Scottish nationalism was necessary. I mean, my first preference, actually, and this may be a surprising heresy for some people, but would be that if we could reform the United Kingdom, and I really believed it was possible, into a shape that I might find politically tolerable, then that would be my preferred outcome constitutionally. So I'm more of a nationalist with sadness and regret than I am one blazing with passion and anger about sort of Scotland as nation and the requirement for folk for natural, the naturalness of nations. I'm not really moved by that kind of thing. And I think actually if you scratch many people who believe in devolution who are opposing this independence measure, you find people who are not actually so far away from what I think. They just differ slightly in terms of their faith, perhaps, or what they're pessimistic about, what they're fatalistic about. And that may not be an argument to win votes over. It may be an argument to win votes over in terms of the referendum. But I think it's important for us to recognise through these stories about how we feel that actually we're often not as far apart as polarised politics might lead us to believe.
And I think this is what I suppose this was the next thing we were thinking to talk about, Michael, was the Douglas Alexander speech, which has been heavily trailed and heavily flagged up with the last couple of days, because I think that it precisely tried to kind of answer that Devo Max anxiety or querulousness about what the rate of change should be for Scottish self-government and where it should come from. And I think he's trying to kind of, as it were, kind of woo over that third that we all think are the convincible third. Not particularly through that speech, which was full of references to French sociologists, but the intent of it was to sort of say there's a rich grand continuity about being Scotland and Britain that it would be terrible, and it would actually be an emotional loss for you to let go. And it's interesting, if you've ever walked into the Palace of Westminster, and if you ever think for a minute about what the British state is desperate to hang on to in terms of Trident and in terms of military expenditure and in terms of misuse of natural resources and all the rest of it, it's quite easy to get your ire up. But it's also, think for 2 minutes about the Olympic ceremony. Think about what Danny Boyle did to rehabilitate an idea of an inclusive Britishness, and the emotions are pulled a different way again. So I think the interesting thing for the Yes campaign is that part of the high road has to be. I mean, I think I remember when I was watching Borgen, and then in the adverts between the two episodes of Borgen on BBC4 was Bob Sargent Independent. And it drove me completely bonkers, because there was the aspiration, there was the kind of the calm, beautiful state of statehood that you would want living in an independent Scotland to be like, and there, in a sense, was the kind of the psychological underside of it. The idea that all our politics is incredibly local, parochial, and lowbrow. We have to kind of, certainly the high road against the emotional tug of being better together has to be really ambitious. I mean, it has to be sort of saying there's the best in the world that we can benchmark ourselves against. Let's go for that excitedly. Let's actually be a bit semi-utopian, not entirely utopian, but semi-utopian about reforms and institutions that we want to bring to be. And I think that's the emotional counter to the Devo Max angst, is that actually we've got places to go here, and we've got an urgency about it, and we've got ambitions. And I think that's the emotional battle between the two positions, it seems to me.
And I mean, it ties up with what both of you are saying, like with Andrew saying that a lot of people, the Devo Max people, there's not that much of a difference between independent supporters and their position, and maybe Andrew's position. Like, something that Yes campaign and the SNP have constantly pointed out is when the questions are different, the results, instead of being sort of only 30% for independence, when it is like, when the question was, do you want basically all powers removed to the Scottish Parliament, then people say, yeah, absolutely. So it's just this kind of emotional attachment and fear, the constant use of the word separation. And, these kind of things, it just takes a little jump to get over that. It might be in some very clever wording. We need some more wordsmiths, I think.
I think there's that kind of idea about... Pat was talking about marching into the Palace of Westminster, and I know that whenever I encounter sort of big institutions, proud, brash, and boastful of the British state, I tend to get my hackles up. That tends to wind me up. But as you both know, I do live in Oxford, and I do I know a number of folk here from all over the world. Yes, but a good number of.
Sorry, Andrew, I almost got thrown out of Westminster one time.
Almost. That's not good enough, Michael. That's not good enough.
Because we're doing the tour going round, and she's going on about all the statues and who's this guy and what amazing guy he was, and like it's all Japanese and stuff, and it's Winston Churchill, and she's saying what a great guy. And for every brilliant thing she said he'd done, I pointed out one of the more nefarious ones that he'd done, because there were a few. And she was starting to get quite annoyed with this, and then we got to Nye Bevan. I said, I'm surprised he is here. He's not got a statue, he's just got a little bust on a staircase somewhere. I said, I'm surprised he's here. And she said, why? I said, well, he's a socialist. What's he doing here? So didn't go down that well, but sorry to interrupt, Andrew.
That was the interview. That was the interview dispatched from the House of Commons in disgrace.
No, I wasn't thrown out. I was asked I was told my interjections weren't necessary.
All I was going to say was, I think there is sometimes a tendency among folk that are pro-independence who do not understand really at all the emotional tugs of the kind of better together argument. And I should say, and I've said before, I think on this podcast, I don't identify as British at all. That's not an identity I've ever felt I got much juice out of for me. But I do find, living here, sometimes you get these sort of twinges of, isn't it a bally pity that we can't actually live in a country which functions sensibly and which is able to answer these ambitions?
No, sure. I mean, I'm speaking to, I spend half my time in London. Half my work is in London, my partner's in London, my children are in Scotland, half my work is in Scotland. So I've got a different take on it entirely, which is I am sensitive about too much anti-Londonism. I mean, I also used to be down in London in the era of the mid to late 80s, which was the kind of the heyday of the GLC and Ken Livingstone. And that was a fantastic time to be in London, with the city limits, the left-wing magazines, lots of crazy experiments being done with municipal powers. It was absolutely great. So that's my anxiety as well, is to actually separate out the Palace of Westminster from London, the world city, which is, yes, lots of power and money, but yes, lots of huddled masses, lots of bohemia, lots of diversity, and actually a great engine for change and social and cultural change in many ways. And then also, I think a lot of us should be listening to Billy Bragg's anxiety about the rest of England and about when will regional England wake up? There's a real discourse amongst quite a lot of the English left, even amongst some of the One Nation Labourites, actually quite wanting Scotland to become independent so that they can actually figure out the English regional question vis-a-vis centralisation of power in London. You know?
Billy Bragg's come out in favour, hasn't he?
He is, but he's in favour pragmatically because he thinks it will, that Scottish independence will help to begin a discussion about the imbalance of power within England. And it's worth noting in terms of actually the whole question about angsting about the UK, angsting and that particular angst, which is if your Westminster MPs are removed from a Labour equation, we will be consigned to permanent Tory hell. You have to actually look at the statistics. I think it's about 6 or 7 results of Labour victories since the Second World War where Scottish MPs were actually irrelevant to the overall count. It could have been won with English Labour MPs alone. That's an essay that Michael Kenny writes in one of these One Nation Labour pamphlets. So that's another thing we've got to get. Another angst that we have to kind of calm down about is that we're abandoning our comrades down south to permanent Tory hell. There is a winnable Labour England entirely in and of itself. That's a question for actually the English Labour Party and its relationship with the Lib Dems and its relationship to constitutional change going forward. But that's another wee bit of unionist angst that we should begin to allay. Is that these two nations have actually got their own fates actually in their own hands, and there's actually quite a lot of I would say George Orwellian English left patriots, who want the chance to articulate a more modest post-imperial, post-nuke, post-Trident, European-facing Englishness, a more modest Englishness. And I think there's quite a few people who are thinking that Scottish independence can be a lever to that. And I think it's something that we should be talking about within the Yes campaign as well. We can actually liberate England into itself.
I'd like to make the point that I believe that the current Labour Party is very far from that kind of sensibility that you're discussing. I mean, it's a fair question to ask. Do Labour or Tory provide any substantive differences on the menu? I mean, it's tinkering around the capitalist margins, but is there anything substantively different between the two? I'm not too convinced. But anyway, from hope and anger to something that's hopeless and is making people angry. Oh, that was a nice segue. Which is the
was it?
Yeah. We'll leave that for the listeners to decide. But something that is hopeless and is making people angry is the offensive behaviour bill. And this is something I've got a problem with, and I think basically everyone does. So I suppose I'd come in on Andrew. That's a year since the offensive behaviour bill has come in, and it's left a lot of angry people in its wake. What's your thoughts on it after a year?
I think there's different angles, on this, different manifestations of it. I mean, at the time this bill was passed, I was really, really hostile to it. It's a piece of legislation which is drafted really broadly. I've got particular anxieties about freedom of speech in general, and in particular this idea that we should only protect polite speech with which we agree. What's the point if we only defend speech with which we agree? Thus far, in the first 7 months of the Act being enforced, something like 34 people were prosecuted under the legislation, which isn't very much. The Scottish Government estimated that around 165 new prosecutions a year would happen under this legislation, and it seems as if, and the Crown Office haven't produced data on this, that it's there or thereabouts in terms of new prosecutions, or slightly less than that. So, in terms of a piece of emergency legislation which the SNP were desperate to pass, it's a bit of a damp squib, I think, in terms of its manifestation in courts. And certainly there's a number of cases which have fallen through because of the rather curious way in which the Act has been drafted, which make it quite difficult for sheriffs to decide whether an offence has been committed. There's the other question, though, the more sociological, on-the-ground question, which is arguably more important, which is that most law happens, literally in this case, in the ground. Most of the law is mobilised in that environment, not in courts, not by prosecutors. And there is, I think, a worry that the police have been empowered to such a significant extent by this legislation to sanction as criminal behaviour which is offensive, that actually people are feeling rather oppressed by it. And I noticed that the Herald went as far as to describe it in its editorial as approaching police harassment, which I thought was a very sort of peppery description.
A lot of people describe it as actual police harassment, not
I thought it was an interestingly sort of strident and clear position to take on this legislation, because after all, it does actually have constituencies in the country, not least the government, prosecutors